The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat quietly in her private study. The familiar weight of royal duties pressed upon her shoulders, but today felt different somehow. She had been looking forward to a peaceful day at home with the children, while William was away on his scheduled visit to Northern Ireland. The official itinerary had him returning late tomorrow evening, giving her a rare opportunity to simply be a mother without the constant demands of public appearances. Louis was playing with his toy cars in the corner of the room, making soft engine noises that brought a gentle smile to Catherine's face. At 5 years old, he had William's mischievous eyes and her own stubborn determination. Charlotte was upstairs practicing piano, the melodic notes drifting down through the palace corridors like a soundtrack to their ordinary, extraordinary life. George, now 11 and increasingly aware of his future role, was in his tutor's study working on his history lessons about past monarchs who had shaped the nation they would one day help lead. Catherine found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with William before he left. There had been something in his eyes, a distance that hadn't been there before. The pressures of being second in line to the throne were mounting as King Charles continued to delegate more responsibilities to his eldest son. William carried the weight of a future crown with grace, but Catherine could see how it wore on him sometimes. The constant scrutiny, the endless official functions, the knowledge that every decision would be analyzed and criticized by both the media and the public. She picked up her phone to check the schedule for the following week. 3 charity engagements, a state dinner, and a visit to a children's hospital. Each event would require careful preparation, the right outfit, the perfect words. Catherine had learned to navigate the delicate balance between being genuine and being what the public expected of a future queen. It was a dance she had been perfecting for over a decade, but some days the steps felt heavier than others. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly, not wanting to disturb Louis's imaginative play. One of the palace staff members entered with a tea service, moving with the quiet efficiency that characterized everyone who worked in their household. These people had become like family over the years, understanding the unique challenges of royal life while maintaining the proper boundaries. "Thank you, Margaret," Catherine said as the older woman set down the tray. Margaret had been with the household since before George was born, and her presence brought comfort during the more challenging times. There was something reassuring about the routine of afternoon tea, the familiar ritual that grounded Catherine in the midst of a life that often felt surreal. As Margaret left, Catherine poured herself a cup and settled back into her chair. She thought about the conversation she'd had with her sister Pippa the night before. Pippa had been concerned about how thin Catherine looked in the recent photographs from the charity gala. "You need to take care of yourself," Pippa had said with the directness that only siblings could manage. "The world needs you strong, but, more importantly, your family needs you strong." The words had stayed with Catherine because they touched on something she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. The constant pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness or vulnerability, took its toll in ways that weren't always visible. She had learned to smile through exhaustion, to appear serene when her mind was racing with worries, to be the steady presence that both her family and the nation expected. Louis looked up from his cars and toddled over to her chair. "Mummy, when is Papa coming home?" he asked, climbing on her lap with the casual affection that melted her heart every time. This was why she did everything else, for these moments of pure, uncomplicated love. "Tomorrow evening, darling," she replied, smoothing his hair. "But we have a lovely day planned, don't we? We're going to bake biscuits for him." Louis's face lit up with excitement. He loved helping in the kitchen, though his assistance usually resulted in more flour on the floor than in the mixing bowl. Catherine cherished these normal moments, the ordinary activities that connected her to the life she might have had if she hadn't fallen in love with a prince. The afternoon passed peacefully. Charlotte joined them for the baking session, her natural perfectionism making her an excellent assistant chef. George appeared when the smell of fresh biscuits filled the kitchen, his appetite apparently more pressing than his history lessons. These were the times when they felt like any other family, laughing over spilled ingredients and debating the merits of chocolate chip versus raisin biscuits. As evening approached, Catherine found herself in the drawing room with all three children. They had established a tradition of reading together before bedtime when William was away. Tonight's selection was a story about a brave knight and a wise princess, chosen by Lewis, who was fascinated by tales of adventure and heroism. Catherine read with dramatic flair, giving each character a distinct voice that made the children giggle. "Do you think Papa is like the knight in the story?" Charlotte asked, her perceptive nature always leading to thoughtful questions. Catherine considered the question seriously. "In some ways, yes. Your father is certainly brave, and he works very hard to help people. But the most important thing about Papa is how much he loves all of us." George, old enough to understand the complexities of their situation, nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes I think it must be hard to be a prince," he said quietly. The observation was so mature, so insightful, that Catherine felt her breath catch. Her eldest son was growing up too fast, already beginning to understand the weight of the destiny that awaited him. She wanted to protect his innocence for as long as possible, while also preparing him for the reality of his future role. "It can be challenging sometimes," she agreed carefully, "but it's also an incredible opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. Your father finds great meaning in his work, just as I hope you will when your time comes." After the children were settled in their beds, Catherine found herself alone with her thoughts once again. She walked through the palace corridors, past portraits of previous generations who had lived within these same walls. Each face told a story of duty and sacrifice, of personal desires balanced against public expectations. She wondered what her own portrait would convey to future generations, what legacy she would leave behind. In her bedroom, Catherine prepared for another night alone. The empty space beside her in the bed felt larger when William was away on official business. They had learned to treasure their private moments together because they came so rarely. Even when he was home, there were always briefings, phone calls, and preparations for the next engagement. The demands of royal life never truly stopped. She picked up her phone to send William a good-night message, a small ritual that helped bridge the distance between them when duty kept them apart. The children send their love. "Lewis made you a special biscuit shaped like a crown. Missing you." The response came quickly. "Give them extra hugs from me. Looking forward to being home tomorrow. Love you." Catherine smiled at the simple exchange. Despite everything they had been through, despite the pressures and the scrutiny and the endless obligations, their love remained the foundation that held everything else together. She thought about the young woman she had been when they first met at university, how impossible this life would have seemed then. Yet here she was, having found her place in an institution that stretched back centuries. As she settled into bed, Catherine reflected on the unexpected twist that life had brought. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new moments to treasure with her family. She had learned to find strength in the routine, comfort in the continuity, and joy in the small victories that came with each day successfully navigated. The palace grew quiet around her as night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of London twinkled like stars, millions of people living their own lives, facing their own challenges. Catherine felt the weight of responsibility that connected her to all of them, but also the privilege of being in a position to make a positive difference in the world. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of ordinary moments made extraordinary by love, and the quiet confidence that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together as a family. The last conscious thought that drifted through her mind was gratitude for her children, for William, and for the unexpected path that had brought her to this place where duty and love intersected in the most beautiful and complicated ways. The next morning arrived with typical English weather, a gray sky that promised rain but hadn't yet delivered on its threat. Catherine woke earlier than usual, her internal clock still adjusting to the rhythm of solo parenting during William's absence. The palace felt different when he wasn't there, quieter somehow, despite the constant presence of staff and security. It was a silence that spoke of missing pieces of a family temporarily incomplete. She made her way to the kitchen before the children woke, enjoying the rare solitude of the early morning hours. These moments of peace were precious, allowing her to gather her thoughts before the day's responsibilities took hold. The kitchen staff wouldn't arrive for another hour, giving her the unusual pleasure of making her own cup of coffee in the space where she had taught her children to bake, where family traditions were born from simple ingredients and shared laughter. George appeared first, already dressed in his school uniform with a careful precision that reminded Catherine so much of William at that age. Even as a child, William had possessed an innate sense of duty and propriety that sometimes made him seem older than his years. George was following a similar path, though Catherine worked hard to ensure he also experienced the carefree joy that every child deserved. "Good morning, darling," she said, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Did you sleep well?" George nodded, though Catherine noticed the slight shadows under his eyes that suggested otherwise. "I was thinking about what we talked about yesterday," he admitted, "about Papa and being a prince." Catherine's heart ached for her son, who was already beginning to grapple with questions that most children his age never had to consider. She sat down beside him at the breakfast table, choosing her words carefully. "What specifically were you thinking about?" she asked gently. George hesitated, the way children do when they're trying to articulate complex feelings that adults might not understand. "Sometimes I wonder if Papa ever wanted to be just normal, like my friends' fathers." The question hit Catherine with unexpected force because it was one she had asked herself countless times over the years. She thought about William as a young man at university, how he had craved ordinary experiences and normal relationships. The weight of his destiny had always been there, but in those early years, it had been easier to pretend that choice still existed. "I think everyone, even princes, sometimes wonder what their life might have been like if things were different," she said honestly. "But the most important thing I've learned is that we can find happiness and purpose in the life we're given, especially when we remember why our work matters." Charlotte bounded into the kitchen at that moment, her natural exuberance a stark contrast to her brother's contemplative mood. At 8, she possessed a confidence and spirit that reminded Catherine of her own sister Pippa at that age. Charlotte had already shown signs of the strong will that would serve her well in royal life, though Catherine hoped she would always maintain the spontaneity that made her such a delightful child. "Is Papa coming home today?" Charlotte asked, settling into her chair with the expectation that breakfast would magically appear, as it always did. "This evening," Catherine confirmed, beginning to prepare their meal. These morning routines grounded her, providing structure in a life that often felt unpredictable. "He'll probably be tired from his trip, so we should think of something special to welcome him home." Louis appeared last, still in his pajamas, and carrying a stuffed lion that had been his constant companion since infancy. At 5, he remained blissfully unaware of most of the complexities that surrounded their family's unique position. His biggest concerns involved which toys to play with and whether there would be chocolate chips in his pancakes. Catherine treasured his innocence, knowing how quickly it would begin to fade as he grew older and started to understand the reality of their circumstances. The morning proceeded with the familiar chaos of getting 3 children ready for their various activities. George had his regular tutoring session, Charlotte had ballet class, and Louis would spend the day with his nanny while Catherine attended a virtual meeting about one of her patronages. The Children's Hospital Foundation was planning a new initiative to support families dealing with childhood cancer, a cause that was particularly close to Catherine's heart. As Catherine sat in her study preparing for the meeting, she reflected on how much her role had evolved over the years. In the beginning, royal duties had felt like a series of performances, carefully choreographed appearances where she needed to say the right things and project the right image. Gradually, she had found her authentic voice within the constraints of her position, identifying causes that genuinely mattered to her and finding ways to make a meaningful impact. The meeting was productive, but emotionally challenging. Hearing about families facing unimaginable difficulties reminded Catherine of her own blessings while strengthening her resolve to use her platform effectively. She had learned that genuine engagement required more than just showing up and cutting ribbons. It demanded real understanding and sustained commitment to creating positive change. After the call ended, Catherine found herself thinking about the conversation with George that morning. Her children's growing awareness of their unique circumstances brought both pride and concern. She wanted them to understand the privilege and responsibility of their positions without becoming overwhelmed by expectations or losing sight of their individual dreams and interests. The afternoon brought an unexpected phone call from her mother, Carol Middleton, whose practical wisdom had guided Catherine through many challenging moments over the years. Carol had a remarkable ability to cut through the complexity of royal life and focus on what truly mattered: family, love, and maintaining perspective. "How are you holding up, darling?" Carol asked with the directness that Catherine had always appreciated. "I'm fine, Mom," Catherine replied automatically, then paused to consider whether that was entirely true. "Actually, I think I'm feeling the weight of everything a bit more lately. The children are asking more questions about their future, and sometimes I wonder if we're preparing them properly." Carol listened thoughtfully before responding. "You know, Catherine, I remember when you were George's age, and you told me you wanted to be an artist. I never told you that you couldn't because your father worked in business, or that you had to follow a particular path. Children need to know they have choices, even when some choices are more likely than others." The wisdom in her mother's words resonated deeply. Catherine had always tried to encourage her children's individual interests and talents while preparing them for their likely futures. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant adjustment as they grew and changed. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Catherine spent time reviewing briefing materials for next week's engagements while the children played in the garden under the watchful eye of their protection officers. From her window, she could see George teaching Louis how to kick a football properly, while Charlotte attempted to organize an elaborate tea party for her dolls. These ordinary moments of childhood felt extraordinary in the context of their unusual lives. As evening approached, Catherine found herself checking her phone more frequently for updates on William's travel schedule. The children had spent the afternoon creating welcome home signs, an activity that had kept them occupied while building anticipation for their father's return. Louis had drawn what he claimed was a portrait of William, though it looked more like a stick figure wearing a very large crown. The palace staff moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for the prince's arrival. Fresh flowers appeared in the entrance hall. His favorite meal was being prepared in the kitchen, and his study was organized with the briefing materials that would undoubtedly require his attention before morning. Catherine appreciated the dedication of everyone who worked to make their lives run smoothly, though sometimes the level of service made her feel disconnected from the ordinary experiences she still craved. At 6 o'clock, Catherine gathered the children in the drawing room to wait for William's arrival. Charlotte had changed in her favorite dress, the one she claimed made her look fancy enough for a princess. George sat quietly reading a book about aircraft, while Louis played with blocks on the carpet. The scene was peaceful and domestic, a snapshot of family life that could have belonged to any household if not for the ornate surroundings and the subtle presence of security personnel. Catherine found herself thinking about the early days of their marriage, when every public appearance felt like a test, and every private moment was precious because it came so rarely. They had learned to create intimacy within the constraints of their public roles, to find authentic connection despite the constant scrutiny. The growth of their family had deepened their bond while adding new layers of complexity to their already challenging circumstances. The sound of cars in the courtyard announced William's arrival. The children jumped up excitedly, their carefully planned welcome forgotten in the rush of genuine enthusiasm. Catherine remained seated for a moment longer, watching her family prepare to reunite, and feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation that William's presence always brought. She thought about the young woman she had been when they first met, how impossible this life would have seemed then. Yet here she was, having found her place in an ancient institution while maintaining her sense of self and purpose. The journey had required sacrifices and adjustments, but it had also brought unexpected rewards and opportunities to make a difference in the world. As footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, Catherine took a deep breath and prepared to greet the man who had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight would be about family, about the simple joy of being together again after time apart. In these moments, the titles and duties faded into the background, leaving only love and the precious ordinariness of home. The door opened, and William stepped into the drawing room, but something in his expression immediately caught Catherine's attention. Where she had expected to see the familiar exhaustion mixed with relief that usually followed his official trips, there was something else entirely. His eyes held a weight she hadn't seen before, and the smile he offered the children seemed to require more effort than usual. The children rushed toward him with their characteristic enthusiasm, and William gathered them into his arms with genuine warmth, though Catherine noticed how tightly he held them, as if drawing strength from their presence. Louis chattering excitedly about the biscuits they had made, Charlotte proudly showing him her welcome home sign, and George offering a more reserved but equally heartfelt hug. For a few minutes, the room filled with the joyful chaos of reunion, but Catherine's eyes remained focused on her husband's face. "How was your trip?" she asked when the initial excitement had settled, and the children had been persuaded to give their father a moment to catch his breath. William's pause was barely perceptible, but Catherine had learned to read the subtle signs that others might miss. "Productive," he said finally. "Very productive. The visit went well, better than expected, actually." There was something in his tone that suggested more than professional success, but before Catherine could explore the feeling further, Louis was tugging at William's sleeve, demanding attention for a new toy airplane that apparently required immediate demonstration. William allowed himself to be pulled down to the carpet, where he spent the next 20 minutes engaged in elaborate flight scenarios that involved loop-de-loops and emergency landings. Catherine watched from her chair, noting how William seemed to lose himself in the simple pleasure of playing with his son. These moments of uncomplicated joy were rare in their lives, and she could see how much he needed them after whatever had transpired during his time away. There was a desperate quality to his attention, as if he was trying to memorize every detail of this ordinary family scene. When it came time for the children's dinner, William surprised everyone by announcing that he wanted to help serve the meal himself. This was unusual behavior. Typically, he would review briefing materials or return important phone calls immediately upon arriving home from official duties. Instead, he joined them in the informal dining room, where family meals took place when they were away from public scrutiny. The conversation during dinner was lighter than Catherine had expected. William told amusing stories about his meetings in Northern Ireland, describing the local officials who had gone out of their way to make him feel welcome and the unexpected moments of humor that had punctuated what could have been purely ceremonial occasions. The children hung on his every word, delighted to have their father's undivided attention. Yet Catherine continued to sense an undercurrent of something unspoken. William's laughter seemed genuine, but carried an edge of something that might have been urgency. He asked the children more questions than usual about their activities during his absence, showing intense interest in details that might normally receive only polite attention. When Charlotte mentioned her piano practice, he insisted on hearing her play the piece she had been working on, following her to the music room with an enthusiasm that felt both wonderful and slightly desperate. After the children were settled with their evening activities, George reading in his room, Charlotte working on a puzzle, and Louis building an elaborate castle with his blocks, Catherine and William finally had a moment alone. They walked together to his study, where the inevitable stack of briefing materials awaited his attention. The familiar ritual of catching up on postponed business usually took priority, but tonight William ignored the papers entirely. "Catherine," he said, turning to face her with an intensity that made her heart skip. I need to talk to you about something that happened during the trip. She settled into the chair across from his desk, preparing herself for whatever news had been weighing on him since his arrival. In their years together, she had learned that William often processed significant events internally before sharing them, and the careful way he was choosing his words suggested that whatever he wanted to discuss was more important than typical travel updates. Yesterday morning, during the visit to the community center in Belfast, something happened that I haven't been able to stop thinking about, he began, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. We were meeting with families who had been affected by the economic challenges in the region, people who had lost jobs or were struggling to keep their businesses running. Catherine nodded, familiar with the type of engagement that formed a significant part of William's official duties. These meetings with ordinary citizens were often the most meaningful aspects of royal visits, providing opportunities to understand real challenges facing communities throughout the kingdom. There was this one family, William continued, his voice taking on a quality she rarely heard. A father who had lost his job at the shipyard, a mother working 2 part-time positions to try to make ends meet, and their daughter who had to give up her university plans because they couldn't afford the fees anymore. He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Catherine recognized as a sign of deep emotional processing. The daughter, Emma, was about Charlotte's age when her family's life changed completely. She talked about her dreams of becoming a teacher, how she had always imagined herself in a classroom helping children learn and grow. But those dreams had to be set aside for immediate survival. Catherine felt a chill of understanding beginning to form. She could see where this story was leading and why it had affected William so profoundly. When I listened to her talk about sacrifice and duty to family, about putting aside personal dreams for the greater good, I realized I was hearing echoes of conversations we've had with George. But the difference was that Emma had no choice in her sacrifice, while we're asking our children to accept limitations that serve an institution rather than addressing immediate survival needs. The weight of his words settled between them like a physical presence. Catherine had always known that William struggled with the constraints of royal life, but she had never seen him question the fundamental assumptions that shaped their family's destiny with such obvious anguish. After the official part of the visit ended, I found myself thinking about our children's futures in a completely different way. William continued. Emma's sacrifice was born from love and necessity, but were we asking of George, of Charlotte and Louis? Are we preparing them for meaningful lives? Or are we training them to accept limitations that serve traditions rather than genuine purpose? Catherine felt her breath catch. These were questions that haunted her quiet moments, doubts she had never fully articulated even to herself. To hear William voice them with such clarity and pain made them impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. I kept thinking about George's question yesterday morning about whether you ever wanted to be normal, William said, and Catherine realized he must have spoken with his son before leaving for the trip. The answer is yes, Catherine. I have wanted to be normal more than I've ever admitted to anyone, including myself. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable in a way that years of royal training had taught them to avoid. Catherine could see the cost of this admission in the way William's shoulders carried themselves, in the careful control he maintained over his expression, even in this moment of unprecedented honesty. But it's not just about what I want anymore, he continued. It's about what we're teaching our children about duty and choice, about whether the sacrifices we're asking them to make serve a greater good or simply perpetuate a system because it's always existed. Catherine found herself thinking about her own journey from middle-class normalcy to royal duty, about the dreams and possibilities she had set aside without fully processing the loss at the time. She thought about George's thoughtful questions, Charlotte's spirited independence, and Louis's innocent joy that would inevitably be shaped by expectations he hadn't chosen. "What are you saying, William?" she asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew. William stood and walked to the window that overlooked the garden where their children had played that afternoon. "I'm saying that for the first time, I'm seriously questioning whether we have a right to make these choices for them." Whether we have the responsibility to find a different path that honors both duty and genuine choice. The words seemed to echo in the study's silence, carrying implications that neither of them had been prepared to confront. Catherine realized that William's unexpected early return wasn't just about completing official business. It was about a fundamental shift in how he saw their family's future. The conversation with Emma and her family had catalyzed doubts that had been building for years, forcing him to confront questions that challenged everything they had accepted about their roles and responsibilities. As she looked at her husband silhouetted against the window, Catherine felt the ground shifting beneath them in ways that would require careful navigation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they faced the possibility that their understanding of duty itself might need to evolve in ways neither tradition nor protocol had prepared them to handle. Catherine rose from her chair and moved to stand beside William at the window. The garden below lay in shadows now, but she could still picture their children's laughter echoing across the carefully maintained grounds. The weight of his revelation required careful consideration, and she found herself drawing strength from their physical proximity as she processed the full implications of what he had shared. "Tell me more about Emma," she said softly, understanding that this young woman had become a catalyst for something that had been building in William's consciousness for longer than either of them had realized. William's voice carried a tenderness that spoke to how deeply the encounter had affected him. She was so articulate, so passionate about her dreams, but also so accepting of why they had to change. When I asked her if she resented having to sacrifice her education for her family's needs, she looked at me as if the question itself was foreign to her thinking. He paused, and Catherine could see him reliving the conversation. She said that love sometimes requires us to choose paths we wouldn't have selected for ourselves, but that doesn't make those paths less valuable or meaningful. Then she asked me if I'd ever faced a similar choice, and I realized I couldn't honestly answer her question. The parallel was obvious and painful. Catherine thought about her own transformation from a relatively normal university student to a future queen, about the gradual way she had adapted her dreams to fit royal requirements without ever experiencing a moment of conscious choice about the direction her life would take. "What did you tell her?" Catherine asked. "The truth," William replied, "that I had been born into my role rather than choosing it, and that I was still learning how to find personal meaning within inherited obligations." She listened so thoughtfully, and then she said something that I haven't been able to forget. William turned to face Catherine fully, his eyes reflecting the kind of vulnerability that years of public life had trained them both to carefully guard. She told me that she thought the hardest sacrifices were the ones we make without understanding why they're necessary, but that the most meaningful ones come from conscious choice based on love and understanding of purpose. Catherine felt the truth of these words settle into her consciousness like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. Her own journey to royal life had been gradual, a series of small adaptations that had led to major life changes without clear moments of decision. She had found meaning and purpose in her role, but William's conversation with Emma had illuminated a question she had never fully considered: how much choice had actually been involved in the path that had brought them here. "I kept thinking about George," William continued, "about the way he's already beginning to understand the weight of his future responsibilities. Are we preparing him to make conscious choices about service and duty, or are we simply conditioning him to accept a predetermined path?" The question struck at the heart of Catherine's own concerns about their children's upbringing. She had worked hard to ensure that George, Charlotte, and Louis experienced normal childhood activities and friendships while gradually introducing them to the realities of their positions. But William's words made her wonder whether she had been trying to soften the edges of something that might require more fundamental examination. "What would conscious choice look like for our children?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would challenge everything they had assumed about their family's future. William moved away from the window and sat on the edge of his desk, a casual posture that contrasted with the formality of the room, and the weight of their conversation. I think it means ensuring that they understand both the privileges and the responsibilities of royal life, but also that they know other paths are possible if they're willing to accept the consequences of different choices. Catherine felt a flutter of something that might have been excitement mixed with apprehension. The idea of their children having genuine options had never seemed realistic within the constraints of royal succession, but William's words suggested he had been thinking about possibilities that existed outside traditional frameworks. "You're talking about more than just personal choice," she observed. "You're talking about potentially changing how the institution itself operates." William nodded slowly. "The conversation with Emma made me realize that the most meaningful service comes from understanding why we're serving, not just accepting that we must serve. If we want our children to find genuine purpose in royal life, we need to ensure they're choosing it rather than simply inheriting it." Catherine thought about the recent changes within the royal family, about how King Charles had already begun modernizing certain protocols and approaches. The institution had shown capacity for evolution throughout history, adapting to changing social expectations while maintaining core values and responsibilities. "How would we even begin to explore this?" she asked, surprised by her own willingness to consider such fundamental changes. "Carefully," William replied with a slight smile that reminded Catherine of a young man she had fallen in love with at university. "And together, we need to understand what aspects of our roles truly serve the public good and which ones exist primarily to maintain tradition. We need to explore how our children could contribute to society in meaningful ways while having genuine choice about the specific forms their service takes." Catherine found herself thinking about the patronages and causes that had become central to her royal identity. The work she did with children's charities, mental health advocacy, and early childhood development had evolved from genuine personal interest and had provided profound satisfaction. The most fulfilling aspects of royal life had come when she was able to use her platform to address issues she cared deeply about. "What about the practical considerations?" she asked. "The constitutional implications, the public expectations, the impact on the monarchy itself." William had clearly been thinking about these challenges. Change would need to be gradual and carefully considered, with full consultation with the king and understanding of legal and constitutional requirements. But I think there's precedent for evolution in how royal duties are approached, especially when the changes serve to strengthen rather than weaken the institution's relevance and effectiveness. They were interrupted by a soft knock on the study door. George appeared, already in his pajamas, carrying a book he wanted to share with his father. The interruption provided a moment of normalcy, but Catherine found herself looking at her eldest son with new awareness of the questions that would shape his future. William spent time examining George's book with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about the story and listening carefully to his son's animated responses. Catherine watched this interaction with fresh understanding of how naturally her husband connected with their children when freed from the formal constraints that shaped so much of their public life. After George had been tucked into bed with promises of more time together the following day, William and Catherine returned to their conversation with a deeper sense of urgency. The evening had illuminated questions that couldn't be easily answered, but also possibilities that neither had allowed themselves to fully consider before. "I want our children to know they have choices," William said as they prepared for bed. "Real choices based on understanding and love rather than obligation and tradition alone. If they choose royal service, I want it to be because they've discovered genuine purpose in that path, not because they never considered alternatives." Catherine nodded, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't expected. The conversation had brought into the open questions that had been quietly troubling her for months. William's experience with Emma had provided a framework for discussing possibilities they had both been hesitant to voice. "We'll need to be very thoughtful about how we approach this," she said, thinking about the delicate balance required to explore change while maintaining respect for the institution they had sworn to serve. "But I think you're right that meaningful service requires conscious choice. As they settled into bed together for the first time in several days, Catherine felt a sense of connection to William that went beyond their usual intimacy. They had shared something profound in acknowledging the questions that shaped their deepest concerns about their children's futures. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the need to carefully consider how to move forward with their evolving understanding of duty and choice. But tonight, Catherine felt grateful for William's willingness to question assumptions and explore possibilities that honored both their love for their children and their commitment to meaningful service. The unexpected early return had brought more than just physical reunion. It had opened a door to conversations that might reshape how they understood their family's destiny and their roles as parents, preparing children for lives of genuine purpose and conscious choice. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, Catherine felt as though they were approaching it together with honesty about both the challenges and the opportunities that lay ahead.